Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. The sky burned, not with the dying light of the setting sun, but with fire and ruin. Molten streaks slashed through the clouds, carving trails of destruction as the first of the Zarian warships descended. Their hulls, polished obsidian against the churning storm, reflected the carnage below. Cities swallowed by flame, skyscrapers buckling under the weight of their own collapse, and the remnants of humanity scattering like embers in the wind. The air trembled with distant screams, swallowed by the guttural growl of the invaders' war machines. The world had minutes left, at least the world as humanity had known it. James Varek pressed his body against the jagged remains of a shattered building, his breath ragged, his rifle heavier than it should have been. He had trained for war, but not this. Not against an enemy that moved like shadows, that struck with the precision of a machine that did not bleed red. He tightened his grip on his weapon, knowing it was nearly useless. A relic of a lost age, no match for the advanced armor and energy fields of the enemy. Still, it was all he had. Above him, a shadow swept across the ruins, gliding silently. He forced himself to remain still. A Zarian vanguard, tall, sinuous, encased in segmented black armor, moved through the wreckage with eerie grace. Their elongated limbs barely disturbed the dust as they advanced, their movements so fluid they seemed almost weightless. Their technology silenced their steps, their weapons fired without recoil, and their eyes, pale, luminous slits devoid of warmth, held no trace of hesitation. James knew hesitation meant death. He exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady as the creature passed inches from him. He could hear the faint hum of its suit, the barely perceptible crackle of an energy weapon primed to fire. It paused, scanning the darkness, sensing something. He gritted his teeth. If it so much as flicked its gaze in his direction, he would be forced to move, to fire. And then he would be dead. A voice crackled in his earpiece, low but urgent. East exit compromised. They're closing in. Move. Now. Lena. Always calm. Always 2 steps ahead. If she was worried, it was already too late. James slid back into the shadows, inching through the wreckage as the vanguard moved on. He had mere moments before the next patrol. The air reeked of scorched metal and ozone, the acrid signature of energy weapons. The city's power grid had failed hours ago, plunging everything into darkness, but the sky still flickered with distant flashes of battle. Somewhere beyond the smog, fighter jets still screamed across the sky in their final, desperate stand. He knew they wouldn't last. Nothing did against the Zarians. Earth had never stood a chance. They had arrived without warning, their warships breaching the atmosphere in perfect synchronization. There had been no declaration, no demands, no attempt at diplomacy. Just the cold efficiency of a species that had done this before, perhaps 100 times, to 100 different civilizations. They had not come as conquerors. They had come as exterminators. Humanity had fought. The global defense forces had scrambled their fleets, had launched every missile, every railgun, every desperate countermeasure they could muster. But the Zarians had technology centuries ahead, shields that absorbed kinetic impact, weapons that disintegrated entire battalions in a single pulse of energy. The resistance had crumbled within days. Now, all that remained were scattered cells of survivors, clinging to the ruins, delaying the inevitable. James reached the rendezvous point, a half-buried metro station, its entrance cracked and sagging like the gaping mouth of a long-dead beast. He slid inside, his boots crunching over shattered glass and spent shell casings. The air was thick with sweat, dust, and the faint metallic tang of blood. The last survivors of Earth's resistance clustered in the flickering glow of stolen Zarian tech, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Soldiers, engineers, scavengers, titles no longer mattered. They were the last threads of a severed tapestry. Lena stood among them, arms crossed, face smudged with soot. Her sharp green eyes met his, assessing, calculating. The western outpost is gone, she said, her voice steady but drained. Chicago, too. We have maybe 24 hours before they reach the bunkers. A murmur swept through the group. Chicago was a stronghold. If it had fallen, the rest of the world wouldn't be far behind. James exhaled. So this is it. Lena's gaze didn't waver. No, she said. This is the beginning. Silence settled, heavy and uncertain. It was a lie, of course. They all knew it. The war was over. Earth had fallen. The best they could hope for was to keep running, to stay hidden a little longer before the Zarians flushed them out like rats. But then, the static in James's earpiece burst to life again. A voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the hopeless quiet. Corin, 5 has fallen. The prisoners staged an escape. They've taken the mines. Every head snapped toward him. The room, once suffocating in its quiet despair, now buzzed with a different kind of tension. Corin 5, a Zarian labor world, one of many planets where captured humans have been shipped off, condemned to work themselves to death extracting raw materials for the war machines that had raised their home. If the prisoners had taken it, if they had seized control of one of the enemy's strongest industrial planets, then it meant something far more important than survival. It meant the war wasn't over. It meant the war had only just begun. The underground bunker was stifling, thick with the weight of too many bodies crammed into too little space. The air, heavy with sweat and exhaustion, carried the scent of rust, scorched metal, and stale breath. A single bulb flickered overhead, its feeble glow casting erratic shadows across the worn faces of those who had outlived the fall of Earth. James Varek sat on an overturned supply crate, his fingers absently tracing the edge of his rifle. The steel was warm, slick with the oil and grime of weeks spent scavenging, running, surviving. Across from him, Lena hunched over a crude map projected from salvaged Zarian tech, her sharp eyes scanning the holographic lines of what remained of the city. The others, what was left of them, stood in uneven circles, some whispering, some simply staring. They had spent so long clinging to existence that the idea of anything beyond survival felt foreign. But the message had changed everything. Corin, 5 had fallen. A prison world, an impenetrable Zarian stronghold, had been seized by human hands. It shouldn't have been possible. Yet it had happened. James had watched the news settle over the others like a slow-moving storm. Disbelief, confusion, then something more dangerous, hope. The kind that made desperate people reckless. The kind that made them think about things they had long since buried. Revenge, rebellion, victory. Lena's voice sliced through the tension. We have one shot at this. No one moved. They had all felt it creeping in, the unspoken understanding that they would not walk away from this. Not intact. Maybe not at all. James cleared his throat, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. The ship. How bad is it? One of the mechanics, a wiry woman named Tessa, exhaled through her teeth. Not great. She leaned back against a rusted wall, arms crossed. We stripped half the systems for parts. The stabilizers are shot. The NAV system's fried. And unless someone here speaks fluent Zarian, flying it is going to be a nightmare. James glanced at Lena. She didn't blink. Can we get it off the ground? Tessa hesitated. Then, reluctantly, maybe, it was good enough. A voice from the back, wary, uncertain. Say we do this. Say we get to Corin 5. Then what? We don't even know who's leading this rebellion. It was true. The message had been fragmented, distorted by Zarian jamming signals. There had been no names, no clear strategy, only the knowledge that, somehow, the prisoners had taken control. If they made it there, would they even find allies? Or just the remnants of another doomed resistance? Lena didn't let the doubt settle. It doesn't matter who they are. What matters is that the Zarians are sending an entire fleet to burn them out. Her voice hardened. If we do nothing, Corin 5 falls. And with it, any chance humanity has left. Silence. James let the weight of her words settle. He could see it playing out already. The black expanse of space alight with fire. The warships descending, the ground turning to glass under their bombardment. He had seen it before, had lived it. He wouldn't watch it happen again. A deep breath. A decision. "We take the ship," he said. "We go." There was no applause, no grand rallying cry. Just the quiet shift of people preparing for the inevitable. James caught Lena's gaze. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph. Only the knowledge that they were about to risk everything, and there was no turning back. They'd spent months running. Tonight they would fly. The stolen Zarian dropship tore through the blackened sky, its thrusters screaming as it punched through the dense atmosphere. Inside, the cabin rattled violently, metal groaning under the strain. James Verrett gritted his teeth and gripped the nearest support beam, his knuckles white. The G-forces slammed into his body like an iron weight, pressing him back, stealing the breath from his lungs. The controls flickered, glitching under the rapid ascent. Tessa's voice came sharp from the cockpit. "Engines are overheating. We hit full burn for too long, and this thing's not built for brute force." Lena, strapped into the co-pilot's seat, barely flinched. "Keep pushing." Tessa shot her a glare. "You want me to melt the thrusters right off this thing?" "We don't have a choice." Outside, the sky darkened, the last traces of Earth's gravity while pulling at them like unseen hands. They were nearly free, nearly out. Then the proximity alarms screamed to life. James pushed himself toward the weapons console, heart slamming in his chest. A red warning flashed across the screen, unreadable Zarian symbols blinking in urgent sequence. But he didn't need to read their language to understand what it meant. Incoming. A glance out the viewport told him everything. The Zarian fleet was no longer drifting in the upper atmosphere. It was moving. 2 interceptors peeled from the nearest warship, sleek and jagged, their engines glowing a cold blue. They cut through the void with eerie precision, closing the distance with terrifying speed. James slammed a fist onto the weapons panel. "We've got company." Tessa cursed. "I can't outrun them." Lena was already flipping switches, her voice ice. "Then we shoot them down." The underbelly turrets hummed to life, targeting systems locking on. James gripped the controls, his fingers flying over unfamiliar configurations. The turret swiveled, the ship's AI struggling to compensate for the movement. The first Zarian fighter opened fire. Energy rounds sliced past the hull, searing white-hot streaks into the darkness. The dropship jolted, warning alarms flaring as the shields took the impact. James squeezed the trigger. The turret spat plasma, a stream of glowing blue cutting through the void. The enemy ship banked hard, narrowly dodging the onslaught. But the second fighter didn't. One shot clipped its wing, sending it into a violent spin. "Got one!" James shouted. The remaining interceptor twisted sharply and fired again. The blast struck home. The cabin lurched. A metal shriek echoed through the ship as the starboard wing took a direct hit. James barely caught himself before he was thrown into the bulkhead. Lena's voice cut through the chaos. "Tessa, starboard thrusters failing. I can compensate, but if we take another hit..." The ship jolted again, harder this time. James grabbed onto the weapons console, his pulse hammering. Outside, the interceptor circled back, moving in for the kill. No time. James wrenched the turret's targeting system, locking onto the incoming fighter. He didn't wait for a clean shot. He fired. A direct hit. The interceptor detonated in a silent explosion, debris scattering through the void. For a moment, the only sound was the rapid beeping of the ship's failing systems. Then Tessa exhaled a breath that was almost a laugh. "We're still alive. That's something." James wiped sweat from his brow, his hands still shaking. "Not for long if we don't get clear of their sensors." Lena had already switched the comms to scan mode. "Any Zarian chatter?" Tessa flicked through the frequency settings. The stolen ship's systems crackled with interference, the alien language distorted but recognizable. Then, through the static, "Human vessel, unauthorized departure, relay to flagship, intercept at next coordinates." James felt the tension coil in his gut. "They're tracking us." Lena's expression didn't change. "Then we change course." Tessa gave her a look. "To where? We can't just float out here and hope they forget about us." James leaned over the navigation panel, scanning for an escape route. The dropship's sensors were crude, stripped of most Zarian tech when they had first stolen it. But something caught his eye, a gravitational anomaly just beyond the fleet's formation. A debris field. "Tessa, can we make it there?" James asked, pointing at the display. Tessa studied it, her brow furrowing. "You want to hide in an asteroid belt?" James shook his head. "Not asteroids. Look at the readings. It's a ship graveyard." Lena leaned in, her gaze sharp. The data flickered in uncertain bursts, but James was right. Hundreds of derelict vessels drifted in the anomaly's pull, old wrecks from past wars, abandoned and forgotten. Tessa hesitated. "That's a graveyard, all right. But if we go in there, I don't know if we're getting out. Better than letting the Zarians blow us apart in open space," James countered. Lena didn't hesitate. "Set course." Tessa grumbled, but adjusted the trajectory. "You better be right about this." The dropship's engines flared, the damaged thrusters sputtering as they veered toward the graveyard. Behind them, the Zarian fleet hesitated, not retreating, but recalibrating. James watched as they approached the wreckage field. The closer they got, the clearer the shapes became. Hulking warships, shattered freighters, broken hulls stripped of purpose. It was a floating graveyard of forgotten battles, a fitting place to disappear. But as they entered the debris field, something else appeared on the scanners. A signal, faint, buried beneath layers of static. Not Zarian, not automated, human. James exchanged a glance with Lena. "We're not alone." Tessa muttered a curse. "This just keeps getting better." The dropship drifted into the wreckage, swallowed by the remnants of war. The Zarians hesitated on their sensors, unwilling to follow. But James knew better than to think they would give up. They had won a battle. The war was still waiting. The ship graveyard stretched before them like a silent battlefield frozen in time. Hulking wrecks of forgotten wars drifted in the cold void, their shattered hulls twisted and broken, stripped of purpose. Some were human-made, remnants of fleets that had once defended Earth colonies. Others bore the smooth, angular design of Zarian craftsmanship, their exteriors scarred by long-forgotten battles. The wreckage floated endlessly, caught in the pull of a gravitational anomaly, an invisible tide of shattered steel and abandoned history. Inside the stolen Zarian dropship, the cabin was quiet save for the hum of failing systems and the occasional flicker of warning lights. The ship was barely holding together, its damaged thrusters sputtering as Tessa struggled to keep them from spiraling into the abyss. James Varek leaned against the weapons console, eyes locked on the debris field ahead. The signal was still there, faint, buried beneath layers of interference, but unmistakably human. "We're not alone," he said. Lena, seated in the co-pilot's chair, studied the readings. It could be a distress beacon, an old one. Tessa let out a short, bitter laugh. "Or a trap. I mean, we did just escape a burning planet with half the Zarian fleet on our tail. Seems a little convenient, don't you think?" James didn't answer. He stared at the signal, its rhythmic pulse steady against the background noise. Something about it gnawed at him, an itch in the back of his mind. It wasn't automated. It was too deliberate, too precise. Lena glanced at him. "You think it's survivors?" James exhaled. "There's only one way to find out." Tessa muttered something under her breath but adjusted their trajectory. The ship lurched as she maneuvered them deeper into the wreckage, weaving between broken warships and jagged debris. The engines groaned in protest, warning lights flashing, but the signal grew stronger. Then, out of the shadows, a ship emerged. It was old, ancient, even, its hull patched with scavenged metal, its markings long since worn away. It was human, but barely. The design was familiar, yet altered, modified beyond recognition. And it was powered. James tensed. That's not a derelict. Lena's fingers hovered over the comms. Someone's alive in there. Before she could send a transmission, their console flared with new readings. Power signatures. Weapons systems activating. Tessa's voice tightened. "They're locking onto us." A static-laced transmission crackled through the speakers, the voice unmistakably human, but edged with suspicion. "Unidentified vessel. You are in restricted space. Power down your engines immediately. James and Lena exchange glances. Lena pressed the comms switch. This is Captain Lena Sawyer of the Earth Resistance. We're unarmed and in need of repairs. Identify yourself. A pause. Then the voice returned, sharper this time. Resistance? There is no resistance. James felt something cold settle in his gut. Tessa exhaled sharply. Well, that's reassuring. Lena leaned forward, keeping her tone level. You're human. That means you know what happened to Earth. We fought. Some of us survived. Silence. Then, the other ship's engines flared to life. You have 30 seconds to comply. Tessa's hands tightened on the controls. Yeah, I don't love this. James's mind raced. If these were survivors, why were they acting like this? And if they weren't? He made his decision. We don't power down. Lena frowned. If we don't, they'll fire. They were going to fire anyway. She hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Tessa sighed. You people are going to get me killed. James turned back to the viewport. The ship before them had no insignia, no markings of allegiance. A ghost ship, lost of time. And yet, someone had kept it running. Someone had survived. The comms crackled again, but this time, the voice had changed. It was no longer sharp, no longer just suspicion. There was something else beneath it now. Recognition. Varek. James's pulse stumbled. The voice was rougher than he remembered, worn by time, but it was one he had never expected to hear again. He swallowed hard. Who is this? Silence. Then a slow exhale. Open your airlock. James's grip tightened on the console. He turned to Lena, who gave him a measured look before nodding. Tessa cursed, but initiated the docking sequence. Metal groaned as the two ships connected, the locks hissing as pressure stabilized. The airlock door slid open with a reluctant whine. And then, out of the dim corridor, stepped a ghost. The man was older than James remembered, his face lined with years of survival. His dark eyes, once sharp with calculation, now carried something else, something heavier. His uniform was a mix of scavenged fabrics and old military gear, a testament to years of scraping by in the void. James took a slow step forward, barely able to form the words. Jonas Varek, his brother, the man James had buried in his memory the day Earth fell, met his gaze and exhaled a weary breath. Damn, he muttered. Took you long enough. The air between them held, charged with 1,000 unspoken words. Tessa broke the silence. Okay, so, anyone want to explain why we're having a surprise family reunion in deep space? James barely heard her. His mind reeled. Jonas had died. He had been on the front lines, leading the defense when the first Zarian ships descended. There had been no survivors. And yet here he was. Lena recovered first. We need answers. Now. Jonas's expression darkened. You won't like them. James exhaled sharply. Try me. Jonas glanced toward the viewport, where the distant glow of the Zarian fleet loomed beyond the wreckage. His jaw tightened. The war's not what you think. James felt a slow dread coil in his stomach. Jonas looked back at him, his voice low. We weren't the only ones who lost Earth. Jonas Varek stood in the dimly lit corridor, his silhouette a sharp contrast against the cold steel walls of the forgotten warship. He had always carried himself with certainty, a man who understood his place in the chaos of war. But now, as he faced his younger brother for the first time in years, that certainty had cracked, replaced with something unreadable. James felt his pulse hammering in his ears. His mind scrambled to process what he was seeing, what it meant. Jonas had died when Earth fell. There had been no reports, no transmissions, no signs of survival. And yet, here he was, flesh and blood, standing aboard a ship that should have been drifting lifeless in this graveyard of forgotten battles. Lena crossed her arms, her stance rigid. You have about 30 seconds to explain before I start assuming you're some kind of clone or a Zarian experiment. Jonas exhaled, rubbing a scarred hand over his jaw. Yeah, I'd probably be thinking the same thing. He let the silence hang for a moment before locking eyes with James. But it's me, little brother, and I'm not the one who has explaining to do. James felt something tighten in his chest. That voice, gravel rough and edged with exhaustion. was the same one he had grown up hearing, the same one that had barked orders over radio transmissions in the final days of Earth's defense. There was no mistaking it. But that only left more questions. James took a step closer, his jaw set. "We thought you were dead." Jonas's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Funny. I thought the same about you." Tessa cleared her throat. "Great. Varric family reunion. Really heartwarming. Can we skip to the part where we figure out why we're standing in a floating scrapyard with a man who was supposed to be a corpse?" Jonas studied her for a moment, then turned back to James. "You brought civilians?" James didn't blink. "I brought survivors." Jonas nodded, though there was something unreadable in his expression. Then he glanced at Lena. "You said you were with the Resistance. You think you're still fighting a war?" Lena's eyes narrowed. "We're still breathing, aren't we?" Jonas let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Yeah, you are, but you're fighting the wrong enemy." James stiffened. "What the hell does that mean?" Jonas's gaze flicked to the viewport. Beyond the thick glass, the skeletal remains of dead warships drifted endlessly, caught in the pull of time and gravity. The Zarian fleet loomed beyond the wreckage, silent but waiting. Jonas turned back to them, his voice low. "You think the Zarians won the war?" He shook his head. "They didn't. They lost." Lena scoffed. "You expect us to believe that? We were on the ground when they leveled entire cities. We watched them hunt the last of us down like animals. We saw them take Earth." Jonas's jaw clenched. "Yeah, you saw what they wanted you to see." James felt his grip tighten on the console. "What are you saying?" Jonas exhaled, shoulders rolling like he was bracing for something. "The Zarians never wanted Earth. Not really. They weren't expanding their empire. They were running." The words landed like a physical blow. James shook his head. "Running from what?" Jonas met his gaze. And for the first time, James saw it. The exhaustion, the weight of something far worse than survival pressing down on his older brother. Jonas didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped past them, moving toward the ship's central console. His fingers danced over the controls, bringing up a holographic display that flickered with static. Lines of alien script scrolled across the screen, interlaced with grainy images of Zarian battle formations, shattered, broken, retreating. "The war didn't start with Earth," Jonas said quietly. "It started long before that, and it wasn't between us and them." Lena leaned in, studying the fragmented data. "If the Zarians weren't trying to conquer us, then what the hell were they doing?" Jonas's expression darkened, looking for a place to hide. A cold unease crept through James's spine. He had spent years hating the Zarians, blaming them for everything. And yet, as he looked at the data flashing across the screen, he realized something chilling. These weren't the battle records of a victorious empire. They were the desperate movements of a species on the run. Tessa muttered, "I don't like where this is going." Jonas's fingers tightened around the console. "They call them the Hollow." Lena frowned. "Who?" Jonas looked at her, his voice quiet but firm. "The ones who destroyed them." James's breath hitched. "Destroyed them?" Jonas nodded. "Not just their colonies. Their homeworld. Their fleets. Everything." He gestured at the wreckage outside. "You think this graveyard is just old war debris? It's not. This is where the Zarians made their last stand. And they lost." Silence settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. James's mind raced. If the Zarians had been running, if they had been fighting something worse, something capable of reducing an empire to ruins, then what did that mean for humanity? Lena broke the silence first. "Why haven't we heard of them?" Jonas let out a slow breath. "Because they don't leave survivors." The words sat like ice in James's chest. Jonas looked back at the screen, his voice grim. "We're not just the last of Earth. We're standing in the aftermath of a war that already ended. And if the Hollow find out we're still alive..." He didn't have to finish. Tessa swallowed. "They'll make sure we aren't." Outside, the stars stretched endlessly into the abyss. And somewhere, in the vast dark, something else was watching. Waiting. The war had never been theirs to win. James Varric stood in the dim glow of the ship's failing systems, the hum of the engines barely masking the weight of his thoughts. Jonas's words still lingered in the air, heavier than the void outside. The Hollow, a name spoken like an omen. A force so absolute that even the Zarians, humanity's supposed conquerors, had been nothing more than prey fleeing from a fire they couldn't escape. And now, Earth's last survivors stood at the edge of that fire, staring into the abyss. Lena's voice cut through the silence. "So what's the plan?" Jonas exhaled, his shoulders tense. "We run." Tessa scoffed. "Brilliant. Run where?" "In case you haven't noticed, the universe isn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for us." Jonas didn't flinch. "There's one place left." James crossed his arms. "Where?" Jonas hesitated, then pulled up the star map. The display flickered, distorted by interference, but a single coordinate pulsed on the screen, a point deep in uncharted space. Lena frowned. "That's a dead sector. No known colonies. No habitable planets." "That's the official record," Jonas said. "But the Zarians had a fallback. A station, hidden off-grid. The last stronghold before they lost everything. If anyone's left, they're there." Tessa shook her head. "And if it's abandoned?" Jonas met her gaze. "Then we keep running." James looked at the star map, then at the wreckage field outside. They had barely survived this long. Every choice felt like a gamble, but standing still wasn't an option. He nodded. "Set course." Tessa grumbled, but turned to the controls, fingers flying over the interface. "If we die in some godforsaken corner of space, I just want you all to know I told you so." The ship lurched as the engines fired. The gravitational pull of the wreckage field fought against them, but they pushed through, breaking free into open space. The Zarian fleet still loomed in the distance, watching, waiting. Then something changed. The fleet shifted. Engines ignited. But they weren't moving toward James and the others. They were turning. Lena's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are they doing?" Jonas's expression darkened. "They've made their choice." The Zarians were running. Again, then the sensor screamed. A gravity distortion, sudden and vast, sent waves rippling through space. The stars themselves seemed to bend. The darkness ahead deepened, thickening, consuming the distant light. It was not empty. It was something else. Something coming. Tessa's hands clenched the controls. I'm no expert, but that doesn't look good." Jonas turned to James. "We need to go. Now." James barely had time to nod before the ship jolted violently, thrown like a toy in a hurricane. The black void ahead rippled, and then, for the first time, they saw it. The Hollow. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't an armada of warships. It was something else. Something vast. A structure? A living mass? It defied form, shifting, twisting in and out of perception like it wasn't bound to the same reality they were. Tessa swore. "What the?" A low, resonating hum vibrated through the ship, a sound that wasn't sound at all, but something deeper, something inside their bones. Lena's breath came sharp. "They see us." James forced himself to move. "Tessa," full burn. "Now." The engines roared, but the ship dragged as if space itself resisted their escape. The Hollow pulsed, and suddenly, wreckage from the battlefield around them began to move. Not drifting, pulling, being drawn into the void. A broken warship, its hull twisted and scarred, vanished into the darkness. Tessa pushed the ship harder. "I don't want to die like that. I really don't." Jonas was already moving, adjusting the course, calculating trajectories. "We brake for the fallback station. If we drop into FTL now, we might make it before." The ship buckled. The lights flickered. Something had touched them. Not physically. Not with weapons. James felt it. A cold presence brushing against his thoughts like fingers trailing over paper. It wasn't speech, not in any way he understood. It was knowing. A whispered acknowledgement. "You do not belong here." He gasped, staggering, gripping the console. The others felt it too. Tessa shuddering, Lena pressing her hands to her temples, Jonas paling. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The ship lurched forward, the resistance vanishing. Space snapped back into place, and the Hollow receded. Tessa slammed the FTL drive. "I hate this job." The stars stretched, the ship surged, and they were gone. The silence that followed was thick, pressing. Jonas was the first to speak. They let us go. James swallowed, still shaking. Why? No one had an answer. They had escaped, but they had been seen. And deep in the void, something had taken notice.